Hey guys, welcome back to Beer Thunder Flight Model Testing Edition. I am your degenerated brain rot buddy Squishface, and we're just gonna get right into it. So we're going back to our good old buddy, the Jazz 39 Gripen, and mainly the flight model in War Thunder. Now, this is definitely a video I'm gonna get some hate mail over, because I am a militant Gripen hater. More so because I spent a lot of time arguing with people that thought the initial flight model was perfectly fine because it matches basically three known data points and nothing else. So, for reference, the Gripen flight model has gone through about 3 different iterations since it was added to the game. There have been 2 to 3 different changes to the flight model, and I'm just going to refer to these as OG, Original Gripen, Revision 1, and Revision 2. We are currently on Revision 2. Yes, there might be 1 or 2 like little minute changes that they made that I might be forgetting, and maybe we're on like Revision 3, but let's not get hung up on the details. We don't really care about those right now. So, what are the differences between all of these revisions? Well, overall, it comes down to the turning characteristics and speed bleed associated with the turning characteristics. And that's something I've been on about. I needed to make the Mirage 2000 video in order to actually get the mechanics of discussing this out of the way and also showcase kind of like how to generate in-game data points and then compare them to real life. The testing process here is much of the same thing. Load the airplane up in the correct configuration, go to the altitude, and turn as hard as possible, then record the results. And I'll repeat these tests more than once just to try to get like a good turn with minimal altitude loss. And it's actually kind of a pain in the ass because as your speed decreases in a horizontal turn, you have to add pitch angle to it above the horizon in order to maintain the same altitude. Doing this with a stick is pretty difficult. It's also why none of these turns are perfectly flat, and this is why I test more than one turn and kind of get like a range of data points and then kind of like look at them and go, okay, this is reasonable. Oh, this one's an outlier. Let's go retest this and see if something was wrong in the way that we were doing things. So, anyways, when the Gripen was dropped, the OG Gripen had a bleed rate of basically no across the entire speed range. Just for reference, here's a video of like the original flight model, and from this duel, you can see how much more speed I have retained than the F-16A Block 10 in just the first turn. I get to basically the same position, have much more speed. The OG flight model was basically, unless it actively flew in front of you, basically impossible to beat. Revision 2 kind of tuned that back just a little bit, and Revision 3 has kind of dropped that back to kind of a pretty significant extent. Now, is it overperforming? Let's find out. So now, what is actually known about the Gripen in real life? Well, quite a lot is known, but also not a lot at the same time. The one thing that has really screwed the Gripen flight model is that there is not a publicly available flight manual for it, and there's no in-depth data that shows sustained turn rates as a function of speed, and there's no published bleed rate data. What the developers are doing is basically constructing a flight model based off of a slim handful of known data points from various sources and basically creating a flight model based on vibes. The sources that are currently available for the Gripen are an article called Aerodynamic Design Evolution of the Saab Jazz 39 Gripen, and then there's also various anecdotes online. As far as I can tell, Gaijin is trying to match the sustained turn rate at sea level of around 18 to 20 degrees per second and a maximum instantaneous turn rate around 28 to 30 degrees per second. The other data points that they're trying to match is acceleration from Mach 0.5 to Mach 1.1, which is allegedly 30 seconds. There's another test from a Czech source, I think, that shows an acceleration of Mach 0.8 to Mach 1.1 in 30 seconds, but none of the testing conditions are like actually known. We don't know the altitude. So if it's at sea level, it's one thing. If it's at a gajillion feet, that's another thing. The other source that kind of exists is a South African document that shows the Gripen having a sustained turn rate of 12 degrees per second and an instantaneous turn rate of 24 degrees per second. Now, this little fact sheet doesn't name the altitude, but when you compare it to other aircraft in the same booklet, the context clues indicate that it's a 15,000-foot test in the light air-to-air configuration, i.e. our 50% fuel and 2 missiles. This is the same standard that a whole host of other NATO airplanes use for their EM charts, including the Mirage 2000 and the F-16. Now, in the last video, we already determined that the Mirage 2000 flight model is kind of fucked. Its bleed rate is too low by noticeable margins. Well, how did the second revision Gripen compare to the Mirage 2000? So we have one broken flight model versus another broken flight model. the same AOA, the same speed, and the Gripen has more turn rate and half of the bleed rate. And this comparison was universal across the board with the Gripen versus any plane at the time. That is a screenshot from revision 2. We are on revision 3. We're going to get to revision 3, but like a good storyteller, we got to start in the middle, jump around a little bit, and kind of, come to a conclusion. This is a cinematic masterpiece of brain rot, I guess. So in order for this to make sense, we need to look at the EM diagrams for the Mirage 2000 and the F-16 side by side, because this is a good example of two planes having fairly similar turning performance while arriving at that turning performance in two different ways. The F-16 essentially takes a moderate-sized wing and puts a ridiculously powerful engine behind it, while the Mirage 2000 comes at it from the opposite end and takes a massive wing and puts a moderately powered engine behind it. So for both EM diagrams, the primary thing we're looking at is the negative peak SEP value, so the specific excess power. And lo and behold, at 4,500 meters, they both have peak bleed rates of over negative 800 feet per second. The Mirage 2000 having a significantly higher peak, but it also has a significantly higher initial turn rate. Even at an apples-to-apples comparison, the Mirage 2000 can do an 18 degree per second turn for a negative 800 value. Under the same conditions, the F-16A can do a 19 degree per second turn. The thing that the Mirage 2000 can do that the F-16 cannot, though, is that it can pull a lot more when it wants to. This would especially be more prevalent at lower speeds due to angle of attack limitations. The F-16 has around a 24 to 25 degree angle of attack limitation at lower speeds, while the Mirage 2000 has a 29 degree angle of attack limitation. Now, because this is War Thunder and because this isn't real life, we can't just take the real life EM diagrams and just compare them at face value, because we also know that the Mirage 2000 flight model is also not perfectly accurate to its EM diagram. So we have to control for this, and we have to be talking apples to apples and not apples to potatoes comparisons. And so basically what I did is I went out and I tested the F-16. And the model I tested, the F-16A, the ADF, the Block 15, because that is the EM diagram that I have on hand that I can access and cross-reference. So first off, the F-16A does not have the same angle of attack limitation in the game that it does in real life. This is largely irrelevant to this point of the discussion, but I figured that I should acknowledge it because someone wants to bring it up. The same can also be said for the Mirage 2000, but it cannot be said for the Gripen. The Gripen has an AOA limiter, but it's a pseudo AOA limiter where Gaijin has altered the properties of the plane to not allow it to exceed around like 26.5 degrees AOA, or at least 26.5 in like kind of flat turns. If you rudder roll it and do stuff, you can exceed 30 and whatnot. But I figured I should acknowledge that, get that out of the way in the front half of the video, so if someone isn't going, well, like, don't get too confused. With that being said, let's talk through the EM diagram. So first off, the F-16A does not pull as hard as it should at this altitude. It is limited to 8.5 Gs at this altitude, and this isn't really a true limit in the sense that Gaijin has modeled a flight computer. Gaijin has done a thing where they approximate a flight computer by altering the aerodynamic properties of the flight model itself. This is why when the F-16 was dropped with its 9G limiter, as you went up in altitude, you actually didn't even get 9 Gs, you'd only get like 7.5 at certain altitudes, and as you went higher, the G limiter was more severe. This is also why when I talk about the G limiter, I'm always careful to call it a pseudo G limiter, just to clarify that Gaijin has not actually modeled any kind of flight computer system. Anyways, enough with that tangent. We're going to look at our red lines, our little red rooftop that looks kind of like a barn. We notice that the shape is more or less correct, but it basically looks like it's been skewed to the left. This already indicates to me that the F-16 flight model overperforms at low speeds, but we can't just look at the graph. We need to look at the specific excess power values as well. Those are in the table in the little bottom right. It's kind of badly done. I do it in Microsoft Paint because I'm lazy. I don't have I'm not Adobe Photoshopping and making super duper like Excel graphs or anything like that. So bear with me. So what happens is the bleed rate that we start out with is negative 435 feet per second. It peaks at 605 and then it tapers down to around 250 at low speeds. In comparison, if you look at the EM diagram, you can see that the peak bleed rate for the Mach 0.7 to Mach 0.6 is negative 900 feet per second. This is a pretty large error. At these two data points, the flight model should have a much higher bleed rate. The bleed rate at higher speeds seems reasonable, while there also seems to be some excessive speed bleed at lower speeds. Overall, if my testing is correct and there are no methodology errors or anything like that, I think it is fair to say that the F-16A is overperforming, but we can also say that the developers are putting in an honest effort to model the turn rate characteristics of these planes more or less correctly. The margin of overperformance for the F-16A, for example, is probably not to the same extent that the current Mirage 2000 flight model is. This does not tell the full story, though, because we're going to talk about the Gripen. We are simply laying the groundwork to compare the Mirage 2000, the F-16, and the Gripen in game. But squish my canards! I can hear you fucking shouting as you chug your last pint of Guinness and contemplate calling for someone's ethnic cleansing. Well, good for you. What if I were to tell you that there is another EM diagram out there for a fighter that is unstable, has close coupled canards, and has both higher thrust loading and higher wing loading than the Gripen? Because let me introduce you to something called the Lavi, IAI's ugly stepchild, and let me introduce you to John Golan, a guy who wrote a book about the Lavi and even made a nice YouTube video about it. And he even actually responds to his YouTube comments. To do a quick speed run of the Lavi story, basically Israel made a close coupled canard multi-role plane that for all intents and purposes could be considered a kissing cousin to the Gripen. The same body of aerodynamic research and a similar design philosophy resulted in the two planes being remarkably similar to each other. Heck, even the initial design phases of the Lavi were intent on using the General Electric F404 engine, which is what the RM12 engine in the Gripen is derived from. The Israelis looked at the design that they had for the F404 and they calculated that, hey, we can get more use out of the plane, we can make a better plane if we add a larger engine and then upscale the plane a little bit. They had three different options. They could have went with the F404 and then all the way up to the F16 engine. They picked an engine that was basically in between the two. So the way the Lavi scales is that it's basically a little bit bigger than a Gripen, a little bit smaller than an F16. The Israelis built the plane, they flight tested it, and then they didn't adopt it more or less because Lockheed Martin, the U.S. government, State Department pressure, politics came into play, and basically the U.S. said, well, what if we just keep selling you F-16s for cheap? Or at least that is the story as I understand it. Overall, though, the Lavi has lower wing loading and higher thrust loading than the Gripen. It also gains more aerodynamic efficiency from the canards than the Gripen does. This is according to John Golan, a guy who has wrote an entire book about the Lavi and actually had it published. This is not just me pulling random numbers out of my ass. I have gone even so far as to ask John in his YouTube comment section about the specific excess power of the Gripen versus the Lavi. To put things bluntly, the Lavi versus Gripen comparison is probably the fairest possible comparison to a known existing plane that I can make, short of someone just leaking the energy management diagram directly from Saab. If you want to do that, send it to me. I'll post it on YouTube. I think it'll be funny. And then I could get extradited to Sweden and become a full-time War Thunder player. That sounds terrible. I think I'd rather just go to an actual gulag. Quick, someone send me classified documents on the Su-27 bleed rate, please. Go, 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 go. So what does the Lavi diagram tell us in relation to the Mirage 2000 and F-16 diagrams, the real-life diagrams, not in-game? Well, first off, the Lavi has a higher instantaneous turn rate than the F-16 of around 24 degrees per second. This is also 1 degree higher than the Mirage 2000. In the sustained turn rate, the Lavi has a sustained turn rate of around 14 degrees per second, which is nearly identical to the F-16 sustained turn rate, and it is 1 to 1.5 degrees per second better than the Mirage 2000. So what about the speed bleed? Is the Lavi radically better? The answer is no, not really. The Lavi still experiences bleed values in excess of 1,000 feet per second for its peak initial turn rate. Also, a turn rate of around 18 to 19 degrees per second will generate negative values of around minus 1,000. Once again, this is pretty much in line with the Mirage 2000 and the F-16 values. And finally, we have made it to the end of the video, finally to talk about the Gripen as it currently stands in the video game War Thunder. So how does the Gripen compare? Well, I did a little bit of drawing on the Lavi chart, and here is what we got. Now, the first thing to notice about the Gripen is that we basically have an initial turn rate cap of 20 degrees per second from Mach 0.9 to Mach 0.7. This is around 2 degrees per second higher than the in-game Mirage 2000 and 1 degree per second over the F-16A Block 15. But it also means that the Gripen has been gimped by the same kind of pseudo G limiter that the Mirage 2000 and the F-16A experience. What about the speed loss, though? So remember how I said Revision 2 had double the specific excess power of anything in the game? Well, Gaijin kind of fixed it. At least they fixed it from Mach 0.9 to Mach 0.8. The high speed bleed values are basically in line with the Lavi. The Mach 0.8 value is in line with the Mirage 2000, which is a data point that looked more or less accurate in our first video. After this, though, this is where things go completely fucky. From Mach 0.7 on down, the bleed rate is orders of magnitude less than the Lavi. No, seriously, look at this shit. Lavi experiences bleed rates of around minus 1,000 feet per second for a 20 degree per second turn at Mach 0.7. The Gripen experiences a bleed rate of around minus 500 feet per second for the same kind of turn, literally half of that of the Lavi. And it ends up diverging even more at low speeds. If we discard the Lavi comparison for a second and just compare it to the F-16 real EM diagram, a similar turn would result in negative specific excess power values of around minus 900 feet per second. But we're in War Thunder, and not only is the Gripen overperforming here, but this is also a speed range where the F-16 in-game also overperforms. So how bad is it really? Well, if we take the real bleed figures and divide them by the in-game figures, we can kind of visualize the results with a factor. For instance, the only two data points where the F-16 doesn't bleed enough speed is Mach 0.7 and Mach 0.6, and obviously everything in between that. If we take the 900 value and divide it by 513, we come up with a correction factor of 1.75 for our first overperforming point. If we take 900 and divide it by 605, we get 1.48. These factors are just to give us an idea of how far off the bleed rate is in comparison to real life. But really, these only apply to these specific data points. So what happens when we hold the Gripen to the same standard versus the Lavi? Well, our correction factor at Mach 0.7 would be 2.3. Mach 0.6, it goes down to 1.97. We get to Mach 0.5, it is a 2.5 times difference. Mach 0.4, it's 2.97. Basically, what this means is that at Mach 0.4, the Gripen in-game bleed rate is literally 1/3 of the calculated bleed rate of the Lavi in real life. Even when we compare the raw numbers to the F-16 and Mirage 2000 that we have in the game, the Gripen still bleeds an order of magnitude less speed than both of these flight models once it crosses that Mach 0.7 barrier. The only reasonable points in its bleed envelope are above Mach 0.7, and everything else below that is most likely completely wrong. If slapping canards on an airframe had the effect of having the bleed rate of similar planes, then everyone in the world would have redesigned their planes to incorporate close-coupled canards. As it stands, there are really only 3 successful fighter designs that incorporate a delta wing with close-coupled canards to my knowledge. The Gripen, the Rafale, and the J-10. The Eurofighter doesn't actually count because its canards are not close-coupled. They are not close enough to the wing itself. The Eurofighter is a long-coupled canard design. So overall, what does this mean for us in the game? Well, it likely means that we have already experienced Eurofighter Typhoon levels of performance in the form of the unnerfed Gripen variations. It also means that the dynamic between F-16 versus Mirage 2000 versus Gripen versus Su-27 is fundamentally flawed within the logic of the actual game, because not only does the Su-27 underperform in terms of bleed rate, but the F-16 and the Gripen also overperform by the same standard. And the margins that the Gripen is overperforming or likely overperforming against anything else that we can compare it to or anything that we can calculate is even more egregious than even the F-16. Now, does any of this actually matter? No, probably not. ARB is going to be 16v16, morons flinging missiles at each other until the enemy team dies and the game snowballs. And obviously, the fact that the Su-27 is held back in maneuverability and that allied planes are buffed in maneuverability hasn't really been a determining factor in the overall win rate, loss rate kind of thing. Basically, the common rebuttal to the Su-27 stuff and the F-16 stuff and all that stuff is, but my R-27ER, and that dichotomy is still going to continue with the introduction of my Fox 3s. Maybe the game changes, maybe it doesn't. So why even make a video about this? Well, number one, I find it interesting, and it is worth my time to go through the effort and talk about it and try to draw some conclusions. And number two, I care about realism. I don't want planes within the game to be plane-shaped avatars. Like, I can understand the perspective of not wanting to have a 9G limit on everything and have planes like handle like their bricks above Mach 1, because the 1.5 times G limit is integral to the way that AirRB and mouse aim works. At the same time, if you're going to adhere to realism, they should adhere to realism in a similar standard across the board. If the F-16 and the Gripen are going to overperform in terms of bleed rate, because that would make the flight model accurate within the War Thunder universe, everything else should be held to the same standard, or the same lack of standards in the apparent case that the Gripen flight model is. Anyways, that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me ramble on for 20 minutes. Post-production squish here, I watched the video and I wanted to add a couple of things. So, number one, I think it's important to understand that the developers probably actually do try to model planes accurately, and that getting flight models to agree into a simulator game is not something that's very easy. Every flight simulator has variations on what it does for realism and has variations from the real life EM diagrams. That is perfectly normal. The second thing that I want to say is that don't take everything I'm saying at complete face value. I have given you guys the resources to go out and duplicate my test and see if my methodology is correct, because I'm always trying to correct the methodology and come up with an even more reasonable conclusion. It might be, for instance, that the War Thunder real-time interface SCP calculation has like a large margin of error in a way that maybe the bleed rates actually are correct. I don't know, but seeing the deviation from what WTRTI calculates and what the EM diagrams do, I'm pretty confident in this assessment, but I'm always going back and reevaluating it. And the last thing that I would like to add is that correcting the Gripen flight model, making it believable, is probably not as obvious as it looks, because on the surface it looks as if you increase the drag ratio that you would end up with something that duplicates its real-life performance, or what you would think the real-life performance would be. For instance, I could see Gaijin developers increasing the sustained turn rate of the Gripen from around 18.5 degrees per second at sea level up to around 20.5 degrees per second at sea level, and then compensating for that increase, or basically undoing one or two of the previous nerfs, but then increasing the drag curve multiplier. So you would have that high initial turn rate, but you would also experience high rates of speed bleed, comparable to what we would think that the real life numbers would be. Okay, now that is the video. We are done. We don't have to talk anymore. I'm gonna go buy another 6-pack.